There are 5 big magic system mistakes that you might be making in your fantasy novel. I saw a lot of these when I judged over 100 magic systems as part of a contest that I ran, and from having coached over 200 writers in my different classes and programs, I've also seen many of these problems in their novels as well. And in my own fantasy books, I've also created many different magic systems, which has taught me a lot about this aspect of writing. Now, the first magic system mistake is really important to avoid because if you make this mistake, it's gonna make your magic quite boring for your readers. To explain this mistake, I'm gonna give you 2 different examples and I want you to think about which one you find more interesting. So, in our first example, we have a magic system where you can create portals and you can step through the portals to teleport to different locations. Okay, in our second example, we have the exact same setup, but the longer the portals stay open, the greater the risk is of these demonic eldritch entities coming crawling out of the portal because the portals kind of connect to this other dimension. And the bigger the portals are or the further away they are from each other, the higher the chances are of these eldritch entities emerging. Okay, which magic system is more interesting to you? It's probably number 2. But why is that? Well, if we look at the first example, that magic lacks consequence. You can use the power and there's not really any downside. Now, that can be fine, but power is more interesting when it comes with a price. Without genuine consequences, downsides, and risks for using magic in your story, it can all just feel a little bit too easy. For instance, let's say you've got a character in trouble, and another character can use their magic to save them. That other character has the choice of, do I use my magic to save this person who's in peril, or do I not use the magic? And that choice is just not very interesting. If, on the other hand, the magic slowly drives you insane every time you use it, now we've got a much more interesting choice. Now the choice is, well, do I save this person and risk the magic turning me mad? Or do I let them die in order to preserve my own sanity? And that choice there, that tension, that's far more interesting. To give you some more inspiration, here are 5 types of consequences you can build into your magic systems. Number 1, physical consequences. Using the magic tires you, it hurts you, it disfigures you, and so on. For instance, in my fantasy novella, Fires of the Dead, to become a pyromancer, you must allow part of your body to be hideously scarred by an ancestral flame, which is this huge flame that contains the hive mind of all of your dead ancestors. The second type of consequence you can use are mental consequences. So here, using the magic impacts your psychological state. For instance, in the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks, we have this light-based magic system where you can draft different colors of light and use that to build physical hard light structures. But if you draft too much of one particular type of light, it's going to slowly alter your personality. So if you're drawing from a lot of blue light, that's going to turn you into quite a cold, rational, calculating, and emotionless person. By comparison, if you draw a lot of green light, that's going to make you very wild and uninhibited and frenzied. The third type of consequences to consider are social consequences. This is where using the magic carries some kind of stigma or impacts your standing or your relationship with others. For example, in the Wheel of Time, tapping into the male half of the One Power gets you hunted and persecuted by the female users of the One Power. That is because the male half has been tainted and it slowly drives you insane if you use it. You can see here, this is actually combining a mental consequence with a social consequence. So that's an interesting thing to consider as well, the way that you layer consequences on top of each other. The next thing to consider are environmental consequences. This is where using the magic creates some kind of effect in the world and impacts its ecology. For instance, in the Tangled Lands, everybody can use magic, but whenever you use the magic, it causes these poisonous brambles to grow across the world. And these brambles basically kill you if you nick yourself on them. And then the fifth and last type of consequences to consider here are moral consequences. So this is where using the magic has some kind of negative ethical outcome. For instance, in Blackstone Heart by Michael R. Fletcher, there's a magic system where you can create magical armor, magical weapons, and other types of magical items. But in order to do it, you basically need to sacrifice a ton of souls of humans in order to bind a demon to that object to give it its magical enchanted powers. Now, this brings us to the second common magic system mistake that I see a lot of writers make, which is treating your magic as a tool rather than as a window. What do I mean, and why is this important to avoid? Well, again, let me give you 2 examples. In our first example, you can fly with this magic. That's it. In our second example, you can fly with this magic, but only when you are feeling angry. Now, in that first example, the magic is just a tool. But in the second example, where you can only fly when you are angry, using the magic is going to give us a window into the psychological state of your characters. In other words, you want to design a magic system in a way where it lets you say interesting things about the people who use the magic. This is something that writers get wrong all the time because it is so easy to just be single-mindedly focused on coming up with all these different cool powers or all these interesting uses of the magic. And that is important. But if your goal is to use this magic in a book that you are writing, you need to always be asking yourself, how will this magic system serve my plot, my characters, and my theme? And then how can I design the magic in such a way that it allows for really interesting payoffs and cool moments in my story? A great example of this is the Patronus charm in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. It's a spell that repels the Dementors, but you can only cast a Patronus when you're thinking of something happy. Now, on the whole, I would say there's a couple of issues and inconsistencies with the Harry Potter magic system overall, but one area that works really well is the whole arc of Harry struggling to learn the Patronus charm in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. When we get to that climax, and he finally is able to cast the Patronus charm in order to save Sirius Black and save his past self, because there's some time travel shenanigans involved there, it really shows Harry's growth as a character, and it also shows his newfound self-belief and his love for Sirius. Now, of course, that is just one way to use your magic system to say something interesting about your characters. To give another example of how you might do this, imagine you've got a magic system where every finger that you cut off gives you a different magical ability. If you have a character who's only lost one finger, maybe we can deduce from that this person is a bit timid, they're afraid to push things further, or perhaps they're just clever enough to get by with that single magical power. But if we meet a character who has cut off all 10 of her fingers, that probably tells us that this person is extremely power hungry, maybe a bit ruthless, and probably quite greedy. The magic serves as a window into her psychology. So as you can see here, what it really comes down to in your own writing is looking for ways to cohesively integrate your magic into your plot and your characters. And speaking of plot, if you would like my help in plotting your fantasy novel, then I have an upcoming book called Plotting Your Fantasy Novel. I know, not the most imaginative title, but basically it goes into the process of structuring your book, designing your scenes, creating interesting character arcs, building conflict, tension, suspense, writing twists, and so much other stuff. In short, it's going to give you a full step-by-step playbook for writing an interesting fantasy novel. Currently, the book is with my early reader team. They're sending through some really great feedback at the moment, so thank you to everybody who's in my early reader team. But if you would like to be emailed when the book is ready for you to buy, just go to jedherne.com/plot. Or you can click the link down in the description below. I put a ton of effort into writing this book, so I really think you'll find it quite useful. Let's move on to the third common magic system mistake that I often see. Poor introductions to how the magic works. This is so important to avoid. There's two big ways that the introduction of your magic system often goes wrong. The first one is trying to show too much of it at once. If we look at something like Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, in that story, there are 16 different base allomantic metals, and each metal corresponds with a unique power. Can you imagine how confusing it would be if our first encounter with this magic system was Sanderson trying to explain all 16 of these powers at once? Fortunately, that's not what Sanderson does. Instead, he starts by just showing a few powers in action in very small, easy to understand instances. For example, in the prologue, we get this passage. Kelsier burned tin. It was simple for him now, after years of practice. The tin sat with other allomantic metals within his stomach, swallowed earlier, waiting for him to draw upon them. He reached inside with his mind and touched the tin, tapping powers he still barely understood. The tin flared to life within him, burning his stomach like the sensation of a hot drink swallowed too quickly. Allomantic power surged through his body, enhancing his senses. The room around him became crisp, the dull fire pit flaring to near blinding brightness. He could feel the grain in the wood of the stool beneath him. He could still taste the remnants of the loaf of bread he'd snacked on earlier. Here, this shows us just one metal and one power in action. But it also gives us a really clear and really interesting promise, which is, hey, this is just one of the metals and this is just one of the powers. You're going to see a lot more if you just keep reading. Try to use the same approach in your own writing. Don't give us the whole pie of your magic system straight away. Just find one interesting slice and use that to hook us and get us intrigued so that we want to know more about all the other components of your magic. Now, the second way that magic system introductions often go wrong is not finding a way to actively dramatize the magic. In other words, the mistake here is just telling us what the magic does rather than finding a way to show it through action. Because the thing is, it's just not that interesting to have a character sit there and verbally lecture us about how the magic works. You might need some dialogue to explain your magic, of course, But if you can, it is way more interesting to show the magic in action. Think of it like a tutorial level in a video game. With a tutorial level, you are playing out the game and you are actually having fun while you are learning. You're not just there reading a big old dusty encyclopedia of how the game operates. Let me show you how I applied this idea in my own fantasy book, Kingdom of Dragons. In chapter 2 of the story, we meet Roven. He is an initiate, he is training to become an apprentice to a Sun Warden. And in his latest test, Roven and a bunch of other initiates must cross over the floor of an arena, fighting past soldiers along the way to get to an escape tunnel. Here's how the Emperor explains this task to him. All participants may strike with full force, and before we begin, I will give you a sun touch. Beside Roven, Cameron and the other initiates stiffened. Roven gulped. He'd never felt a sun touch before. It was an aspect honed by only a half dozen Sun Wardens, and it was a power used almost solely for executions. If you were sun touched, the effects of the sun's rays would grow slowly magnified until the heat crackled your skin, boiled your eyes, and burned your body to a husk. Roven had seen blasphemers and criminals killed with the sun touch before, and it was always a horrible sight. He tried to focus. What was the antidote? It was a rare aspect for a Sun Warden to develop, but he'd been reading about this just the other day. Roven glanced at the shadowy passageway leading out of the proving ground. Shadows. That was it. Submerge yourself in enough darkness, and it would break the sun touch. But with that hole in the roof, there were no shadows in the arena, and between Roven and the tunnel stood a line of soldiers. Roven receives a sun touch, and then the test begins. As he struggles to fight his way across the arena, the sun gets hotter, he begins to feel his skin burning, he begins to feel his skin crisping up, and he knows that if he doesn't make it to that exit tunnel in time, he's going to die. Now, obviously, I'm biased, I wrote this book after all, but I think it makes for a pretty interesting scene. It doesn't make you sit through a verbal lecture about how this magic works. It shows you right away, and it also makes you curious about the other aspects that a Sun Warden can potentially develop. Try to take the same action-based approach to introducing the magic in your story. Now, the next magic system mistake is a really subtle one that I rarely see discussed, but it has a massive impact on the effectiveness of your plot. To explain this fourth mistake, let's imagine we're reading chapter 10 of your story. Now, in this chapter, your mentor figure tells our main character, who is her apprentice, that her magical abilities are going to allow her to use X-ray vision to see through solid objects. For context, we had no idea this was possible earlier in the story. Then, in the next chapter, chapter 11, our apprentice is captured and he is thrown into a locked room. Fortunately, he remembers his X-ray vision and he's able to see through the lock and to use that knowledge of the lock's internal workings to pick it, to make it open, and to escape. Okay, well, what is the mistake here? Well, this setup I described where we learn about a skill in chapter 10 and then it's immediately used in chapter 11 to solve a story problem, it could work, but it's probably going to feel a bit convenient and a bit lucky for readers. Your reader is going to be sitting there thinking, oh, that's awfully fortunate, the fact that he just learned about this skill and now it's immediately getting him out of a problem. So the mistake here is having too small a gap between explanation and exploitation of a magical ability. This is particularly dangerous when it comes to using your magic to solve those really big story problems that your character faces. If we exaggerate this to the worst case scenario of this mistake, let's say that you tell us that the magic allows you to have 4 different powers. But then, in the climax against the main antagonist, your character discovers a 5th magical power, which was never set up or never explained previously, and they use that 5th power to win. That is just not going to feel satisfying at all. It's going to feel like cheating. To quote Brandon Sanderson's first law of magic, an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. So what is the better solution? The better solution here is to lengthen the gap between setting up our explanation of the magic system and then exploiting that explanation later in the story. Or in other words, paying off the use of that power. One of the things that is so satisfying if you can get this done right is if you give us an explanation of how your magic works on page 50 of your story, have the reader remember the basics but forget some of the finer details as we go through the rest of your narrative, and then on page 200, your character solves a problem with a rule or feature or a interaction or exploitation of the magic system's abilities that we kind of forgot because we were so distracted by what was happening in the story, but as soon as it happens, we immediately remember why this is possible. It's kind of like a bit of a writing sleight of hand where the answer was there all along, it was just hidden in plain sight. To use an analogy here, it's a little bit like the Battle of Helm's Deep in the film version of The Two Towers. Before the battle, Gandalf says, "Look to my coming at the first light on the 5th day." So, leading into the big siege, we already know that Gandalf is on the way with reinforcements, but there is just so much chaos and so much happening in the battle that we kind of forget about it. So when Gandalf finally appears and brings reinforcements, it is this massive stand up and cheer moment because we immediately remember, oh, that's right, he told us about this, but we had kind of forgotten that it was actually happening. Now let's move along to the fifth big magic system mistake. To explain this mistake, let's say you have a magic system where there's like a dozen different powers your character can use. The magic is going to allow them to turn invisible, or to enhance their strength, or to throw firebolts, or to read people's minds, and a couple of other random things like that. Now, of course, that sort of scattergun approach, that could be done well, but more than likely it's going to feel a little bit random, and it's going to feel like it's really lacking in cohesion. That is because, in that example there, you've gone wide with your magic. But usually it is a much better approach to go deep. Personally, I find that one power with 10 different applications is so much more interesting than 10 random powers, each with their own very specific use case, but no real relation or organizing principle behind them. I love when you can create a simple, adaptable magic system where there are very clear rules, and yet there are kind of an infinite amount of possibilities and an infinite amount of ways that you can use the magic. That is what going deep with your magic is all about. For instance, let's take the sympathy magic system from The Name of the Wind. The core principle here is that you can bind two objects together, and then whatever happens to one object will affect the other. This has a lot of different applications. For instance, you could use it to set traps. Maybe you bind a string to some floorboards, you put the string in a doorway, and then when people walk through that doorway, they break the string and it snaps the floorboards underneath them, causing them to plummet down and fall on some spikes. Or maybe you can create a kind of voodoo doll from like a wax mannequin, and then you link that mannequin to a person using their blood, and now you have this kind of doll that you can use to remotely torture the person in question. Or you could use this sympathy magic system to make a very crude communication device. Maybe you link a coin that's in your house and a coin that's in your friend's house on the other side of town. And whenever you flip the coin on your desk, it flips the coin on their desk. So you can use that to kind of communicate with each other in a sort of Morse code style pattern. With your magic system, I really think this is the gold standard to get to. To get to a place where the magic is very clear to understand, but there are kind of an infinite number of really interesting, creative ways that your characters can use it. Fundamentally, we come to stories to see characters solve difficult problems with novel and surprising solutions. And designing a magic system so that it is adaptable and so that it does have a lot of different ways that it can be used is a great way to get to that point. Now, if you're wanting more inspiration for developing your own magic system, check out this video over here. Inside this video, I have 100 writers send me their magic system ideas, and I pick my favorite one to receive a $1,000 prize. Keep writing and keep striving, and I'll see you in the next video.